right, so today we're going to talk about genetics, and the first term that you need to be aware of is homologous chromosomes. And homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that carry the same information. You get two chromosomes, one from your mom, one from your dad. That pair makes up the homologous chromosomes. So you can see here in this picture that these are the two chromosomes. Here's the maternal one from mom. The paternal is from dad. And so each of these chromosomes carry the same set of information. They're going to be coding for determining the same traits. Now, on these chromosomes, there's little sections or little areas that code for a particular trait. So for example, this one right here, this area of the chromosome, this little section, determines the seed color in a pea plant. The next section above it is going to determine a different trait. Another little section will determine another trait. And so each of those little sections that controls or determines a particular trait is known as a gene. Now, the genes that get passed from parent to offspring can come in different versions. So it doesn't mean you always get the exact same set of information from your mom and from your dad. That's the same trait that it's the information for, but you can get different versions of those. And those different versions are known as alleles. And alleles can come in three basic types. The basic ones, we're just trying to keep it simple, are dominant, recessive, and codominant. And so you can see here the different alleles for these particular genes for pea plants. There's a dominant allele for yellow seeds, and then there's a recessive allele for green seeds. So you're going to get one of those two versions from your mom and one of those two versions from your dad. So this pea plant right here got two yellow alleles from its mom and its dad. This pea plant got one yellow allele, a dominant, and one green, a recessive. And this pea plant ended up with two recessive alleles for green. Now, the dominant, recessive, and codominant, what that means, if an allele is dominant, if that version of the gene is dominant, that means that it's always going to be expressed. If you have that particular allele, that's what you're going to see in the organism. If it's a recessive gene, the only time you will see recessive genes are when you have two of those recessive genes. And then we'll be talking about codominant later. Those are genes that are actually going to combine, and the way those two genes interact actually produce a third trait. But if you're looking here at the example of the pea plants, this pea plant here got a yellow allele and a yellow allele from both of its parents, and those two are dominant. And remember, if the dominant is present, that's what you're going to see in the organism. And so this plant here is going to end up, excuse me, with yellow seeds. Now this plant got a yellow allele from its mom, a green allele from its dad, but the dominant is still present. If the dominant is there, even if there's only one of those alleles, it still hides or masks this recessive one. Think of the recessive one as being weaker. Oops, didn't want to go on yet. So think of that recessive one as being weaker. Now the only way you're going to get pea plants with the green seeds is if they both have the recessive alleles. That's the only way you can see that weak gene, that recessive gene. The only way it won't be masked or hidden by the dominant is if there's no dominant there. So here there's no dominant, and so these two sets of information from each parent are going to interact in a way that gives you green pea plant seeds. Now, we have certain ways that we are going to write the dominant and the recessive. Hold on. Okay, dominant, recessive. So remember, dominant is always going to mask the recessive gene, and we're going to look at an example here of a widow's peak. And a widow's peak is where your forehead, like the hair right here, kind of comes down into a little point. And the widow's peak is dominant. Having that little point is dominant, and not having that little point is recessive. And if one parent contributes the gene for the widow's peak, then the other parent doesn't, then you're going to get offspring that have the widow's peak because, again, the widow's peak is dominant. So that's what we're going to look at in this example. Now, if you don't know this boy here, he's actually Eddie Munster from the Munsters TV show. You might have seen it. And he has a very distinct widow's peak. Most people's widow's peaks are not that distinct. But we're going to be looking at his parents and kind of using them as an example for their offspring. Now, one of the things that we're going to be using is we're going to use a Punnett square. And a Punnett square is just this simple little tool. I don't know why that keeps going ahead for me. It's this little tool that we can use to predict the offspring, the traits of the offspring, the percentage that are going to have that particular trait. And so when we're using the Punnett square, and I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second, you need to remember a few rules. And the first rule is that the letters are used as symbols to designate genes. And so that's our very first one. We're going to use letters to represent the genes. And the letters are going to be capital letters for the dominant genes. So if you're going to write in for the dominant genes, use a capital letter. And for the recessive genes, you're going to do lowercase letters. And you're always going to, again, have genes existing in pairs. Why is that? Well, that's because we said in sexual reproduction, you're going to get one gene from your mom, you're going to get one gene from your dad for every single trait. It's on those chromosomes, a little section, and it's how those two sets of information from your mom and dad interact that determine what we see in you. So it depends on what's dominant, what's recessive, if it's codominant, and so on, that's going to determine the traits that we see in the offspring. Okay, it's not going to the next slide. Let's try that again. I think we're skipping. Okay, here we go. It's a little slow today. All right, now in the case of widow's peak, we said the widow's peak was dominant. So our rules are for a widow's peak, we're going to use a capital W. If the recessive trait is no widow's peak, so we're going to use a lowercase w. So these are actually Herman Munster's parents on the TV show. So here's his mom, she has a widow's peak, and here's his dad who does not. And these are the letters we're going to use to represent. Capital for dominant, lowercase for recessive. Now, when you're looking at those two different alleles, the two alleles that you get from a parent, here it's for the seed color, could be for a widow's peak, it could be for if you can roll your tongue, it could be for the shape of your nose, it could be for lots of other traits. If you are getting the same two copies, if you get a matching set, the word that we use for that is homozygous. And remember, homo means same, and so these mean you get the same gene. You get two copies of the same gene. So this is going to be homozygous, a matching set. And this is going to be homozygous, a matching set. Notice how it says homozygous down here? Another word for this is purebred. So some of the assignments that we'll be doing will refer to this as purebred, meaning it's pure. It doesn't have anything mixed in with it. Now the opposite, if you get one of each, if you don't get a matching set, in this case it would be one allele for yellow, one allele for green. That's known as heterozygous. Remember, hetero means different. And so you get two different alleles. Also, this is called a hybrid because, again, it's a mix of two different alleles. So remember those terms. Now this one's going to be homozygous dominant, meaning that you got two matching dominant genes. This one's homozygous recessive, meaning you got two matching recessive genes. But again, heterozygous is just heterozygous. You got one of each. So here are the alleles for a widow's peak. If you have two dominant genes, you're going to be homozygous dominant. Same two genes, and they're both dominant. And you're going to end up with a widow's peak. If you get one of each, you don't have a matching set, so you are heterozygous, but you're still going to have a widow's peak because, again, the dominant gene is there, and the dominant gene is actually going to mask or hide this recessive gene. If you get two recessive genes, you're going to have no widow's peak. That's the only way you can have that recessive gene. And again, that's known as homozygous recessive because it's a matching set, so it's the same, but it's homozygous recessive. It's the same two recessive genes. Now on our next screencast, we are going to be looking at and going through looking at Herman's genes and then trying to figure out what Lily's genes are.